World War I raged over the fields of Europe for more than 4 long years, from 1914 to 1918. When it was over, both sides counted their dead. If you include soldiers and civilians, more than 20 million people died as a result of the First World War. The end of the war caused great celebration all over the world. People couldn't wait to get back to living normal lives again. Allied soldiers who were lucky enough to survive the trenches were welcomed home in great style, but they were surprised to find little work. Economically, things had changed a little too quickly. Industry had been concentrating on producing materials for the war. The shift from a war economy to a normal consumer market was difficult and slow, especially in Europe, where much of the infrastructure had been destroyed. Despite the difficulties, America was one of the first to get its post-war economy moving again. The assembly lines that had churned out war materials were soon mass-producing new products: airplanes, radios, automobiles, kitchen appliances. As manufacturing increased, people started finding work again in the factories. And with regular paychecks and easy credit, they started buying again. The more they bought, the more business boomed. This simple economic cycle kick-started the economy, and America was back on the rails. In Canada, the post-war boom took place largely on the wheat fields of the prairies. Europe had been torn apart by the war and desperately needed wheat and flour. Canadian farmers took advantage of this and bought more land and modern equipment, mostly on credit. And they began growing and selling wheat like never before. It was the same in manufacturing and logging. As Europe began to get back on its feet, it couldn't get enough manufactured goods and raw materials. And from the factories of Quebec and Ontario to the forests of British Columbia, Canada was happy to oblige. By the mid-20s, Canadian farmers were making a lot of money, and the boom looked like it was going to go on forever. Wheat prices peaked in 1924, but farmers still increased production year by year, and everything they produced, they sold. But wheat farmers all over the world were doing the same thing, and Europe was growing less and less dependent on foreign wheat as it recovered from the war. By 1928, there was simply too much wheat on the world market, and prices started to fall. Not drastically at first, but enough to make a few farmers question if they should have bought all that new machinery and land on credit. In the 1920s, most European countries were preoccupied with salvaging their industries and their economies from the devastation of the First World War. Britain had suffered very badly during the conflict. 750,000 soldiers hadn't come home. It had borrowed heavily from America to pay for its war effort and needed to get its economy moving again so it could repay that debt. But exports were down, especially textiles and coal. Inflation and labor problems, including a crippling general strike in 1926, kept Britain from recovering quickly in the post-war years. Unemployment remained high all through the 20s. France, too, owed money it had borrowed to pay for the war, but it had a strategy that gave it an edge in world trade. It kept the value of its franc low, and that, in turn, favored exports. This, along with strong domestic markets, led to a gradual but solid recovery throughout the 20s. In Germany, things went from bad to worse. In 1919, at the Palace of Versailles, just outside of Paris, France, a peace treaty between the Allies and the Germans was signed. In it, Germany officially accepted the blame for causing World War I. As punishment, and as a way to pay back to the victors what fighting the war had cost, Germany agreed to pay reparations. In total, 131 billion gold marks. It was an impossible sum to pay. The Treaty of Versailles had also taken away from Germany a lot of its industrial land and capital, as well as its colonies that were rich in resources. In fact, with that treaty, the whole face of Europe changed. New borders were established, as well as new countries. And it had placed very strict regulations on German trade with other nations. So the same countries that were demanding that reparations be paid had seriously limited Germany's ability to earn the money to do so. For a while, Germany borrowed money from the United States with limited success, as Germany was seen as a credit risk. Desperate, Germany then borrowed money from Britain and France so it could pay its reparations to Britain and France. It was insane and not sustainable. With nowhere to turn, Germany simply printed more money, a guaranteed route to inflation. As the value of the German gold mark dropped to almost nothing, the problem of paying reparations grew even worse. The German people watched their money grow more worthless each day and suffered the inevitable result: crippling poverty. Eventually, Germany contained its inflation and negotiated huge loans from the United States with a more realistic repayment schedule. This was known as the Dawes Plan. In the latter half of the 20s, things in Germany were beginning to look hopeful again. As the 1920s unfolded, the United States found itself in the economic driver's seat. Its economy was booming, and Europe began to pay back the billions of dollars it had borrowed to finance its war effort. A 10-year party broke out, the Roaring Twenties. The crazes of the 20s reflected the attitude of a people determined to enjoy prosperous times. Flappers in bobbed haircuts dancing the Charleston, the rise of jazz and blues music, alcohol was prohibited in 1920, which had the curious effect of increasing the amount Americans drank. Bootleg whiskey supplied by very competitive gangsters was smuggled into thousands of speakeasies. Times were good, jobs were plentiful, and people were starting to live the American dream. By the end of the 20s, they heard on their new radios their president, Herbert Hoover, promise a chicken in every pot, a car in every garage. But there was another craze that captured America's attention in the 20s: playing the stock market. Credit made it easy. You could buy any amount of stock for as little as 10% of its value and borrow the rest. Here's how it worked. If you wanted to buy 1,000 shares of a company's stock, which is priced at $10 a share, the total price would be $10,000. But you could purchase all 1,000 shares by paying only $1,000, 10% of the full price. This down payment is known as the margin. When the shares rose in value, as they always seemed to do in the 20s, you paid off the loan with your profits. This is called buying on margin, and as long as the value of the shares kept going up, everything would work out okay. But if the value of the shares dropped dramatically, you'd still be liable for the $9,000 loan. You'd have to pay it all back, and your broker would be putting pressure on you to do just that. During World War I and through the early 20s, the stock market went through its usual ups and downs, nothing out of the ordinary, really. By the mid-20s, the new popularity of playing the market, and easy credit, of course, began to make stocks very much in demand, and that caused their value to keep rising. But this value was based on the demand for the stock, not the performance or actual worth of the company. As a result, the stock of most companies was greatly overvalued. Many economists of the time were very worried about this. They knew that at some point a free market had to correct itself, that eventually all those overpriced stocks would drop to a more realistic level. They pressured the government to intervene, to bring some control and regulation to the stock market. But the U.S. in those days was following an economic policy of laissez-faire, which meant to leave things alone. The politicians trusted that the market would correct itself. At the same time, all through 1929, there were indications that domestic and foreign markets for manufactured goods, wheat, and steel were starting to slip. Many countries around the world had started to put tariffs on imported goods to protect their domestic markets. So American factories started to stockpile their manufactured products. And in the stock market, share prices had been erratic all year, even more than usual. So there were signs, many of them ignored, that things weren't right, that the marketplace was out of balance, and that something had to shift. October 24th, known as Black Thursday, was the first sign that something had gone seriously wrong. Stock prices began a downward trend, and investors quickly began selling to limit their losses. As prices continued to fall, panic set in, and before the day was out, almost 13 million shares had been traded. The next 2 days, Friday and Saturday, the market had a modest recovery. Overall, stock prices stayed low, so on Monday, the 28th, there was another large volume of trading. Some investors were still trying to get rid of their stock, but others were buying, trying to pick up low-priced bargains. The market seemed to be working the way it should. And then came Black Tuesday, October 29th. From the opening bell, it was obvious something was wrong. There was an immediate explosion of selling. Investors seemed determined to get rid of vast amounts of stock before it dropped any more in value. Brokers watched as prices kept dropping and began calling their clients to pay their margins. But it wasn't possible. Investors had banked on their profits to pay their loans, and their profits were disappearing in front of their eyes. Soon, full panic set in. So many traders trying to dump so much stock so fast caused prices to plummet. Investors, unable to reach their brokers, swarmed to the stock exchange. Police were called to control the crowd. When the smoke cleared, share prices had recovered only slightly. But the amount of trading that day was astounding. More than 16 million shares. In the days that followed, their value kept dropping dramatically. Over the next 2 years, they would drop to rock bottom, and $50 billion would simply vanish. Thousands of investors were ruined, and public confidence in the American economy was shattered. Banks were hit very hard. They too had invested in the market, and as their investments dwindled, they began calling in their loans and mortgages. But their clients were in the same boat. They were broke too, and this led to many banks being wiped out. Some banks did manage to keep going, but people soon decided that their money wasn't very safe in any bank, and they began withdrawing it in record numbers. Many banks ran out of money to cover their investors' deposits, and they too had to shut their doors. In the US alone, almost 10,000 banks were forced to close. With the crash, businesses and factories couldn't pretend anymore that markets would pick up, so they stopped producing and laid off their workers. The unemployed, of course, had no income to spend, so the home market suffered even more. As profits fell and unemployed workers couldn't pay their debts, even more businesses closed their doors. This marked the beginning of a time of great suffering for North America. At its worst, almost 25% of the workforce in the US and 30% in Canada would be unemployed. In many towns and cities, soup kitchens and bread lines became the main source of food for the jobless. Thousands of men chose to sell apples on the street or shine shoes rather than ask for charity. Agriculture played an important role in the economies of most industrial nations at this time. In 1928 and early 1929, farmers in the United States and Canada nervously watched the dropping price of wheat and hoped it wouldn't get worse. Then the crash of '29 hit. Europe scrambled to protect its domestic markets and placed high tariffs on imported grain. Unable to sell huge stockpiles of wheat, Canadian and American farmers watched helplessly as prices hit rock bottom. And that was only the beginning. In their efforts to increase production, farmers had done a great deal of damage to the land. Overgrazing and overplowing left too much of the soil exposed. When the hot, dry winds of the 30s began to blow, they carried the dusty soil away. By 1931, the drought had established itself over much of the Great Plains. Then in following years, great swarms of grasshoppers gobbled up what little wheat would grow in the dry soil. In Canada, the next year brought rust, hail, and frost. It was impossible to even think about making a profit growing wheat. R.B. Bennett became the Canadian Prime Minister just as the Depression took hold. He immediately spent $20 million to help the unemployed, but it was like throwing a cup of water on a burning building. Unable to pay their mortgages, thousands of farmers across the prairies lost their farms to the cash-starved banks. So they left, packed up their families, and headed out in all directions, hoping to find work. They couldn't afford gasoline, so many of them hooked up their farm horses to old automobile chassis. They called them Bennett buggies, after the Prime Minister, who many blamed for their troubles. In the U.S., the migration of the unemployed and farmers gone bust was mostly westward. As they traveled, they looked for work or a new place to farm. But with so many of the states affected by the drought, they just kept moving until 2.5 million migrants ended up in California. And they were hardly made to feel welcome. While many entire families were uprooted, most of these wandering unemployed were men, some as young as 16. They kept moving from town to town and city to city, all across the US and Canada. They got around by hitching a free ride on freight trains. They would work for food. A sandwich and a cup of coffee would be paid for with chores like hoeing a garden or fixing a roof. They might find a place to sleep and maybe even a bite to eat in the hobo jungles. These were collections of shelters thrown together with cardboard, tin, and planks, and anything else they could find. While a few of these men were content with this life on the road, most were desperate to find permanent work and return to a more normal family life. After the crash, most countries quickly tried to protect their domestic markets by placing high tariffs on imports. This only made matters worse by effectively bringing world trade to a standstill. In Britain, lack of world trade meant there was soon little demand for new ships. Without a healthy shipbuilding industry, markets for steel and coal fell even further, and wages were cut and workers laid off. The textile industry was the next to go, and more workers were let go. Unemployment in Britain would soon reach 22% of the labor force. Before 1929, the French economy had been doing relatively well. The United States had even agreed to forgive France's war debt by more than 60%. But eventually, high tariffs put in place by the US and many other countries would have a crippling effect on the French economy. Unemployment climbed dramatically, and production would fall by more than 20%. Germany, by the end of the 1920s, had recovered quite successfully, mostly due to loans it had received from the US. Its economy was doing well, and it had even started paying its reparations again. But as soon as the American stock market collapsed, US bankers called in their loans, and Germany once again plunged into an economic depression. In Australia, in the early part of 1929, prices for wool and wheat and other commodities started to drop due to overproduction all over the world. Then, after the crash, the tariffs on imports in their usual markets were disastrous for Australia. Many farmers and ranchers were ruined. They simply couldn't sell their growing stockpiles of wool and wheat. Over the next 2 years, almost 1/3 of the country's labor force would be out of work. People lost their jobs, their farms, and their homes. In the United States, Herbert Hoover was unlucky enough to be president when the Depression hit. His Republican administration quickly put in place a program that helped businesses, banks, farmers, and the unemployed. But he was criticized for not doing enough for the poor, who he insisted were a local responsibility. This reputation as a cruel, uncaring president, whether he deserved it or not, led to his defeat in the election of 1932. His replacement was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR, they called him, a Democrat and a charismatic leader. His policies would reflect a renewal of confidence that he tried to instill in Americans.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance.